So today we're going to be talking about revolution and internationalism. I've got just a short presentation here for you guys, so we should have plenty of time for some great discussion after this. But before we dive into the topic, I first want to set up a framework of goals, strategy, and tactics and how they relate to each other. So whenever you're trying to formulate strategy and tactics, it's really important to always work backwards from the goal. Strategy should flow from the goal and tactics should flow from your strategy. And I think that this is one area that liberals and reform socialists have a lot of problems. They say they decide on the strategies that they want to use first, and then they just hope that that's going to add up to an effective strategy, an effective plan for achieving their goals. I think maybe one good example of that is people who tend to retweet. They pick that tactic just because it appeals to them and not necessarily, they don't necessarily know how it plays into the larger ecosystem of political activism. So. I would encourage you to think about which of these strategies seem appropriate for socialists. Revolution or reform? Would you consider internationalism or nationalism more appropriate for socialists? Or would you consider disrupting capitalism more appropriate than participating in capitalism? Well, in my mind, the truth is that any and all of these strategies are valid, but none of them can accomplish our goals on their own. You just have to keep in mind that we're aiming for the total liberation of all people from oppression and capitalism. So any strategy that helps further that goal is really accomplishing what you want it to accomplish. And if you don't believe me, here's a few examples of strategies that typically aren't associated with socialists working to our end. So for example, reform can be used to protect unions and disarm the state. And so that can actually be very complementary to revolution. Because of course, there's many barriers that can get in the way of revolution that reform sometimes has a way of getting around. Nationalism can help in cases where there is an oppressed country or people like Palestine and Tibet, and it helps to drive opposition to their imperialist oppressors of China and Israel. And of course, participation in capitalism is encouraged by the two-stage theory. And this theory basically just says that a capitalist revolution is the most effective way to overthrow feudalism. And it's only after the capitalist revolution that you can experience a socialist revolution. And I think that, to sum that up, Marx puts it pretty well when he says that capitalism sows the seeds for its own destruction. And I think that if that's true, then we should definitely participate in helping them sow those seeds of their own destruction. So with that framework in mind, let's just go ahead and talk about internationalism now. Working backwards from the goal of liberating all oppressed people, it makes all the sense in the world to create an international coalition of proletarians to fight that oppression. If we want to liberate all people, then we need to include as many people as we can in our coalition, and that's going to necessitate being as international as possible. Also, a couple more points about internationalism is that national borders can be used by the bourgeoisie to divide and weaken the working class and to pit us against each other. And in this conversation, it's important to keep in mind that national borders are completely imaginary. They're essentially a way for the bourgeoisie to materialize their power. They have a vision for the world, and they're forcing everyone else to abide by their vision of the world by literally drawing it onto the globe. So Lenin believed that the most important aspect of internationalism was the right to self-determination, which, if you don't know, that's the right to secede for any nation, any kind of people to secede from its mother country, and also optionally to either form an independent country or to join in with another pre-existing country. So as long as a nation is allowed to secede, then of course they're never going to accept oppression from any sort of imperialist powers, because why would you when you can just create a nation that doesn't oppress your people? So I think that really the importance of secession in the internationalism question boils down to consent of the governed. If you cannot free yourself from any sort of imperialist power or mother country, then what consent is there really? If you can't secede, then you never had the option to reject a government. So a couple of reasons why nationalism are useful is that, first of all, it can be a unifying force. And ultimately, that's our goal, is to build solidarity and unity. And building that camaraderie in struggle against oppression needs to happen in a variety of different ways. So nationalism can help with that. And also, this next point is especially important for nations which don't currently have a state associated with them, is that a sense of national identity can really help preserve cultures and also languages that are in danger of being lost. If nobody's out there, vouching for people to continue using, say, Gaelic or the Navajo language, then I think that those could definitely be lost without some sense of national pride in those heritages. So despite these advantages, I think ultimately it needs to be said that nationalism can be extremely dangerous. First of all, if nationalism takes precedence over the common interests of the proletariat in solidarity, then that's a huge problem. And historically, the bourgeoisie has used nationalism to divide the proletariat time and time again, convincing the exploited masses of their own country that they're on the same side when they're in fact not. Also, it needs to be said that capitalists have been drawing their economic might from around the world for a long time. So we need to draw the might of our people from around the world as well. Otherwise, we're just putting ourselves at an unnecessary disadvantage. And finally, as I'm sure you all know, nationalism has been used as an excuse to commit countless atrocities around the world. It really, at its worst, nationalism is just a terror on the face of our planet. I think Lenin puts it pretty well in this quote. He says, "The elements of democratic and socialist culture are present, if only in rudimentary form, in every national culture, since in every nation there are toiling and exploited masses whose conditions of life inevitably give rise to the ideology of democracy and socialism. But every nation also possesses a bourgeois culture, and most nations a reactionary and clerical culture as well, in the form not merely of elements, but of the dominant culture. Therefore, the general national culture is a culture of the landlords, the clergy, and the bourgeoisie." And this is probably the most critical element for why nationalism can be dangerous, is because it's controlled by the bourgeoisie. It is a tool at their disposal, potentially. So a couple more points on internationalism before we can move on to revolution. First of all, returning to this idea of consent of the governed, we need to absolutely have completely free and open borders to ensure that each citizen lives where they want to live under the government that they want to live under. And I think obviously, again, you have to have a choice about which government you choose to support, and that really can only come from open borders. Also, national borders, of course, allow for the unequal treatment of different people. I think that we see how much better Americans and the supposed first world gets treated by corporations than the even more exploited masses of various places in Africa and the Middle East. So let's talk about revolution. If reform is working within the bounds of an existing power structure to change society, then revolution is changing society by upending that power structure and all power structures. Acts of revolution can be anything that upend a power structure, big or small. So it can be simply an unlawful protest, saying that the government cannot force you not to protest, or it can be as large as a protracted guerrilla warfare. Revolution can be used by either the proletariat or the bourgeoisie to distribute or consolidate power respectively. And I think that this one is really important because you can't just ask if there's a revolution. You have to ask if that revolution is truly benefiting the people that it claims to support. I think in the past, there have been examples of revolutions that said that they were supporting the people, but only ended up causing more chaos and a more authoritarian government that further suppressed their own people. Before we go all in on revolution, I think let's take the time to consider when reform can sometimes be useful. First of all, the full force of revolution needs to be timed carefully. It's not something that you can just go around trying to do willy-nilly. It requires a lot of organization and a lot of sacrifice. And reform doesn't necessarily require that same level of input from us. So it can be utilized a bit more broadly. And also reform can definitely help build class consciousness in a lower stakes environment than revolution. Because of course, one of the main strategies that we like to use is building class consciousness. So achieving small goals legally together can be useful. Also, holding elites accountable to their own rules definitely is good for us. It throws a wrench in their propaganda machine and it ties them up with some of their own rules. So even considering that, though, I think that it needs to be said that reform is woefully insufficient to accomplish our goals on its own. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, I think that, again, we need to work backwards from the goal of total human liberation. This is going to require dramatic, drastic, large-scale changes, and that does not mesh with the small incremental changes that come with reform. I think that reform also needs to be looked at as, again, a tool of the bourgeoisie because the power structure within which we're reforming was built by them. And it was built in order to ensure the bourgeoisie's power in perpetuity, even if the people try to achieve some kinds of reform. So by adhering to their rules, we're definitely playing right into their hands and we're doing exactly what they want to do, even if it seems like we're achieving some victories. Also, I mentioned this before, but the bourgeoisie is absolutely prepared to engage in revolution against us if we don't engage in revolution against them first. If they feel that their power is slipping, they will absolutely tear down the existing power structure and put in place something that is more authoritarian and more oppressive. So this is similar to internationalism in that if we let them use this strategy and we don't use it ourselves, then they're going to have a leg up on us. So also, reform tends to result in compromise between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and that's sort of the point of it. But again, that's not productive towards our goals of achieving a truly equal world. And also, it needs to be said that symbolic reforms have been extremely successful at taking the steam out of socialist and communist organizations that fight for the oppressed. I'm sort of concerned about that personally right now with the sentencing of Derek Chauvin. It is a symbolic victory, but it really does very little to help the overall plight of people of color in the country right now. And we need to make sure as we move forward that we don't let this most minor of victories appease us in any sort of way. And I don't have it listed here, but I think one more important thing to say about reform is that it is very slow and intentionally so. And these reforms aren't happening in a vacuum. While we're trying to accomplish these reforms, the bourgeoisie is consolidating their power much further. And if the bourgeoisie achieves 10 victories in the time that it takes us to achieve one, have we really accomplished anything? So now let's talk about Chile. In Chile, Allende was referred to as the world's first democratically elected Marxist president. And on the surface, this sounds great. If we have enough people supporting a Marxist president to elect him, that's definitely a wonderful step in the right direction. But Allende didn't live up to maybe a lot of the hype that existed around his rise to power. He primarily was a reformist. He brokered agreements between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and for even trying to span the gap between those two groups, he was killed at the hands of a right-wing coup within just a short period of time from when he was elected. And during that coup, tens of thousands of others in Chile were killed, and it really just decimated the socialist movement for many, many years to come. Also, Allende only was able to be elected as the result of the work of revolutionaries that did amazing work. They occupied 130 factories and engaged in over 5,000 strikes in Chile in 1970. And the change in culture, the cultural shift that took place as a result of the work of these revolutionaries is really one of the most important things that actually got him elected. So ultimately, he betrayed these people that could have been his staunchest supporters by giving the false narrative that he could make the sorts of changes that the people wanted only using reform. I think the socialist worker sums it up pretty well when they say Allende can no longer hope to satisfy the owners of industry and the working class. He will have to choose to side with one or the other, but one side is armed and the other is not. He will use his influence and that of the bureaucrats within Chile's working class-based parties and trade unions to persuade workers to put up with harsh conditions and an erosion of last year's reforms. So I think that one thing that's important about this quote is it was actually said in 1971, and it wasn't until 1973 that the coup happened. And in the period between 1971 and 73 are the periods of time where he gave the most ground to the bourgeoisie. So this was really very predictive, I would say. But it's just pretty much guaranteed that it's going to turn out this way if you don't have revolution on your side. So I think, though, the most important question about revolution is not one of theory, but one of practice. I think that implementing a revolution, it takes a ton of sacrifice. It takes a ton out of the common people, out of us. And so more than attempting to persuade you about the way the revolution should be done or when, I think it's important that we put out the call to action and that we ask ourselves if you'll do what you must to fight oppression in this world. So that's it.